Hey everybody, welcome back to the sanctuary. Although the seas are getting a little rough, storm is coming. That must mean we're getting into some more challenging topics. I'm still your host, Professor C. Still going to be talking about A&P, but we're going to get into bones in such detail that your head might actually explode. So I'm going to start off simply talking about the cranial bones, the sutures, and the fontanelles. So let's get into it. So let's start off our deep dive through the skeleton at the top, basically. And can't get any further from the top than the cranial bones. So let's give them a try. There will be 8 bones that are called cranial bones, and they are, as they sound like, they make up the cranium, which encloses the brain. And on the outside of the cranial bones provides attachment for muscles, especially those in the head and neck, obviously not those in the leg. So the big ones, frontal, and I'll put a big F here on the frontal bone. It would make sense that it would be in front, right? The left and right, parietal. Sometimes you see that meaning wall, so I'm going to put a big P here. There's a parietal bone. If you could see on the other side of that skull, you'd see another parietal bone. So we have to differentiate left versus right. The occipital bone is the bone in the back of the head. I'll put an O back here for occipital. Temporal, again, there is a left and a right temporal, one on either side. This one here is where the ear hole is, and basically where your temples are, although if you think about where the ear hole is, that you're always going to be on the temporal bone. And a little strange one is the sphenoid. Now I'm going to mark it with an S right here. We only see a little part of it sticking up right here. If I can go over here to this other skull and do it again, here's a frontal bone. Here in a P for parietal. Here where the ear hole is temporal. Way in the back of the skull, and really at the base of the skull too, is the occipital bone. And right here is a little bitty sphenoid, at least a part of it we can see. It's much bigger than it looks from that angle. Now the ethmoid is a special one that's not shown here. Now maybe if I could look at the skull over here, I can see a little tiny part of it, but it's not going to help us identify that one right now. So remember, it is considered a cranial bone, but we will see it later. Okay, sutures. Sutures are the cracks in the skull. So they act as a joint that expands as the skull gets larger. Right now, during the natural birthing process, the baby's head has to fit through a narrow canal, and so its head is often kind of pulled into an oblong shape, almost like a football shape. Later, as the brain gets bigger, the skull expands, and you see a more normal looking skull, these sutures will seal up. But let's try to name them real quick. All right, the coronal suture. Coronal suture is right here. I'm drawing it in red. It separates, again, the frontal from the parietal bones. Coronal. Sometimes it's called the frontal suture also, although that can be confusing with another term, so I'm just going to use the term coronal suture. A sagittal suture, and let's just do it like this. I'll do the coronal suture in red, so let's come over here and do the sagittal suture in green. Now this one can't be seen, but remember there are 2 parietal bones, so separating the left and the right parietal bone would be the sagittal suture. All right, the third big suture that you often hear about in A&P classes, let's do in blue. The lambdoid, sometimes called the lambdoidal. After this, letter of the Greek alphabet called lambda. Looks kind of like an inverted Y. And if you look right here, kind of that split right there, that would be a good example of the lambdoid or lambdoidal suture. You can get a little picky on where it begins and ends, but look for that kind of that lambda structure, and you'll find the lambdoid suture. Really, it's separating the occipital, which is back here, from the parietal, but it's also separating it from the temporal bone. Okay, and the one final suture is called squamous suture. We've seen that word before. We'll figure out why it's called that in a little bit. I'll do it in orange here. So right here on the top of the temporal bone is the squamous suture. So if you kind of look at the parietal bone, say, as a country on a map, and you think of there being rivers all around this country, the country separated by rivers, you have the sagittal, right? The sagittal river up north. You have this, what we call a coronal suture, this river in front of it to the west. We have the squamous suture down here on the south of the country. And then to the east side of the country, we have the lambdoid or lambdoidal suture. Another good picture over here, if you want to see a better shot of the sagittal suture, right there. And also a nice shot of the frontal suture, aka coronal suture, going all the way across the skull, separating the frontal bone from the parietal bones. Okay, the calvarium. The calvarium is a fancy word. Basically, if you look here on the skull where you see this chop has been made, it looks like it's got a hinge here. That's obviously not a real anatomical feature, but on models of the skull, they often have a hinge you can pull off and you can remove the top of the skull. And so you could maybe call this a skull cap in your vernacular. You could call it a cranial vault sometimes if you want to sound a little fancy, but calvarium is the most used term for this in anatomy books. And it's just the top of the skull. It's not one bone or any particular bone. You can see it's got a little bit of the frontal, right? A little bit of the parietal here, correct? And then a teeny, teeny, teeny little bit of the temporal bone cut into it too. You may see figures in the future where it says calvarium removed, and that's going to be a hint that someone's pulled this off so we can see deep into the skull. So, as I just queued up, the calvarium here is removed. Now we can see the base of the skull from the inside though, right? And we can see a lot of things we couldn't maybe see before. So if we want to see some of these holes in the skull that are much deeper, or you want to see some of these bones that are hard to see from the outside, you can look inside. So for instance, if I change my color here, say to red, if I look right here, I see what kind of looks like an oval looking bone with little dots in it, and that would be the ethmoid bone. And so now we can finally see it for the first time, but if I looked at it from another aspect, it would look completely different. So we'll talk about it individually in another video. Same is true for the sphenoid. We saw kind of an outside part of it when we looked at the outer part of the skull, but now I can draw a line here and around here and around here. And we see that, wow, that sphenoid bone looks very different when we have the calvarium removed and we can look inside. And I can also see the occipital bone back here. I can see the temporal bones on either side here. And then I can see the frontal bone, both sides of it, even though it's not considered two bones, right there. So we have all of our skull bones here, if you want to say more specifically our cranial bones, that we can see from a calvarium removed image. Okay, suture bones are as it sounds. If you can find a suture, like again, this is going to be the sagittal suture. And then back here you have the lambdoid suture, right? Shaped like Mary had a little lambda. And then these little bones right here is what I'm talking about. These are called suture bones. These little teeny tiny, they look like cracked bones, but every person would have different suture bones in different places. So these are variable from human to human. But another term for them is vermian bones. You pronounce that W like a V, vermian bones. So sometimes you hear about suture bones or vermian bones. These are simply little, tiny, almost random when you compare one to another person's suture bones. And they appear near sutures. Pretty simple. Okay, fontanelles. Fontanelles are the soft spots. If you've ever touched a baby's head, you notice they have some spots that are considered to be soft spots. If you push hard there, you can push down into their brain, so please don't do that. But you'll notice if the baby coughs or shouts or cries, you can see that little soft spot kind of bubbling up and down, almost like a fountain. And that's where the word fontanelle comes from, a little fountain. Of course, there's no water spewing out of there, but it does move up and down until the bone ossifies. So these are unossified fibrous membranes between the fetal skull bones, right? The newborn or sometimes, of course, unborn fetus. There are 4 of them that you hear about oftentimes in anatomy, so I'll just show you them real quick. Anterior fontanelle is this one right there. Posterior fontanelle, let's go around the block and get back here. Mastoid fontanelle is back by the lump in the back of the head. And then the sphenoid fontanelle is found right here near the sphenoid bone, that little pink bone there in the picture. Those are the main 4 you hear about in classes. Now, something that's interesting, even though I feel it should be called the 5th fontanelle, is called the 3rd fontanelle. And if I want to find this guy, let me change my pen so I don't get too confusing in all the spider webbing, is right here. So that can be a tricky one. Some models it's apparent, some models it's not apparent. But there are 5 fontanelles, even though 4 of them are usually asked about on exams. Soft spots. They will fuse up as the infant matures and the skull matures with it. Hope you enjoyed that one. Thanks for watching the video. Check out the others in the series if you want to see more exciting bone lectures. See you for the next one. Bye-bye.